I can still smell the smoke from the protest. Burnt rubber, tear gas. The stench clings to me like shame, sharp and sour, soaked into my skin where no amount of scrubbing can reach it. My ribs ache where the batons landed. 1, 2, 3 strikes. I count them again and again, as if the numbers could make sense of the pain. Each bruise feels like a mark against me, a reminder of lessons I taught too well. The ache in my body is sharp, but the tightness in my chest is worse. It doesn't go away. Every breath feels harder than the last, like my lungs are working against me. Every heartbeat reminds me I'm still here, still alive, when maybe I shouldn't be. I sit on the cold floor of this cell, tracing patterns in the dirt with my finger. Triangles, squares, circles that always come back to where they started. My hands used to hold chalk, used to write lessons on blackboards. Now they shake, dirty and useless. These are the hands of a teacher who taught the wrong things. The light from the barred window cuts across the room, thin and pale. It doesn't reach me. The shadows stretch and shift as the hours crawl by, marking time I can't get back. Do I deserve this? The bruises, the cell, the shame that won't leave no matter how much I swallow. The question circles in my mind, over and over. Yes, I built the system that corrupted them. No, I tried to help them succeed. Maybe I'm both the victim and the criminal in the same story. The thoughts spin faster, pulling me deeper, until I can't tell where one ends and the next begins. And then another thought creeps in, quieter but sharper. What if my guilt is just vanity? What if I'm making this about me, turning myself into the center of a tragedy that isn't mine to own? The idea cuts through me, leaves me hollow. Maybe that's the cruelest part of guilt. It makes you complicit in your own destruction. They call me prisoner 4782 now. The number feels more honest than Headmaster Michael. A title that was once badges of respect now feel like lies. For 37 years, I was the respected educator, the model teacher. But respect built on lies doesn't last. It crumbles, and I'm left here, counting the pieces. 5 days. That's how long I've been in this cell. 120 hours of counting every breath, every regret. The shadows from the bars move across the wall like clock hands, marking the slow, relentless passage of time. Outside, I hear voices rising, fists pounding, anger spilling into the streets. But I know how this ends. The uprising will fade like all the others. The seeds will scatter, but the soil is poisoned, and I helped poison it. I taught my students to follow rules, to color inside the lines, to succeed within the system. For 37 years, I preached order, discipline, respect for authority. And now I sit here because I finally stepped outside the lines I drew so carefully around their minds. My throat is dry. My tongue feels thick. When I swallow, it hurts, not from the tear gas, but from swallowing 37 years of wrong words. Words that taught them to climb without asking what they were climbing toward. words that taught them to win without counting the cost. I gave them the tools for success, yet forgot to endow them with the soul and virtue needed to wield those tools wisely. The memory comes back, uninvited, as clear and cold as the bars across my window. 19 years ago, on an ordinary Tuesday in October, I was 42, standing in a classroom filled with young faces, bright, curious, and full of possibility. The air smelled of chalk dust and fresh paper. Morning light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Beyond the schoolyard, golden rice fields stretched to the horizon, the breeze carrying the faint scent of harvest. And there, I taught them with precision, with purpose, mathematical formulas, historical dates, essay structures. I drilled these into their minds, believing I was arming them for the future. I demanded discipline, rigor, and order, convinced that these were the tools they needed to succeed. But did I teach them to think for themselves? Did I teach them to question? Did I teach them to care about justice, about fairness, about the world beyond their textbooks? The memory sharpens. I was leading a discussion on civil rights movements with my advanced class. 17-year-olds, eager and attentive, hanging on my every word as if I held the answers to all the questions they hadn't yet learned to ask. The freedom fighters believed they were building a fairer society, I said, pacing in front of the blackboard where names and dates were written in neat rows. But change often comes with chaos. Death, terror, uncertainty, and the prowling wolves that follow it. Order, discipline, respect for established systems. These are the foundations of stability. A hand shot up in the third row. David Chen, 17, with earnest brown eyes and a habit of biting his lip when he was deep in thought. His father worked at the municipal office. His mother took in sewing to make ends meet. He was one of my brightest students, always first to arrive and last to leave. "But Headmaster Michael," he said, his voice steady but questioning, "what if the established systems are unfair? What if they allow only a handful of people to monopolize all the resources and exploit the honest, hard-working majority? What if order is just an excuse to suppress those who are trying to make things decentralized and transparent, so that everyone can have a voice in the country's growth? Don't people have the right to resist?" The question hung in the air, heavy and alive. The other students turned to look at me, their faces expectant, waiting for my response. I remember the way the sunlight caught David's face, the intensity in his eyes, the silence that followed as the weight of his question filled the room. And what did I say? What wisdom did I offer to this young mind, reaching for something deeper, something truer? "Such questions are not for examination purposes, David," I said, my tone firm, dismissive. "Focus on your studies. These matters are above your level." The words echo now in this cell, each one a small betrayal. I didn't just dismiss his question. I dismissed his curiosity, his yearning for meaning, his desire to understand the world in a way that went beyond facts and figures. I reduced his search for justice to a distraction, an inconvenience, something impractical and irrelevant. I thought I was preparing them for the real world. I thought I was being responsible, practical. I told myself that moral questions were too abstract, too dangerous, too likely to lead them astray. Better to teach them skills, facts, obedience. Better to prepare them to succeed in the world as it was, rather than dream of the world as it could be. But what kind of world had I prepared them for? A world where success meant looking the other way when injustice happened. A world where advancement came through compliance, not conscience. A world where the highest virtue was staying silent, even when silence meant complicity. After I dismissed his question, I watched David's face change. The light in his eyes didn't just fade, it vanished. His shoulders slumped, and though he nodded and lowered his gaze to his notebook, I knew something inside him had shifted. In that silence, something precious had been lost. I had killed his curiosity. I had taught him that moral questions were inconvenient, that authority was not to be challenged, that success mattered more than integrity. In that single moment, I had planted the seeds of every failure that would follow. The other students learned the same lesson. They watched, they listened, and they absorbed the unspoken message. Don't ask hard questions. Don't challenge the system. Accept the crumbs you are given. Memorize the text. Swallow the doubt. Ignore the context, or become a target. They learned the grim reality. Survival belongs to the submissive. Success comes through obedience, not through courage. In that sunlit classroom, I taught them to climb without asking what they were climbing toward. I taught them to win without counting the cost. I taught them to follow rules without questioning who made them or why. That Tuesday morning in October, I failed David. I failed every student in that room. And 19 years later, I would pay the price for that failure in the most bitterly ironic way possible, at the hands of my most attentive student, who had learned his lessons exactly as I taught them. 3 days before the protest, the letter arrived on a Tuesday. It came on crisp government letterhead, official and cold. The messenger wouldn't meet my eyes as he handed it over. His hands trembled slightly, as if the paper itself carried a weight too heavy to hold. I can still see it now, the clinical language that shattered whatever illusions I had left about the world I helped create. The examination fraud scandal had broken wide open. The entire region's standardized testing system was compromised. Papers sold to prep centers and wealthy families for $800 to $1,500 each. Answer keys circulated to paying students. Merit lists predetermined by payment capacity. But it wasn't the scale of the corruption that destroyed me. It was the name at the center of it all. Sarah Martinez, Board of Education, Testing Division, Deputy Secretary. My student, my pride, the girl who had sat in the front row of my classes 15 years ago. The scholarship student from a working-class family who wrote essays about serving the community through education. I remembered her graduation speech, how she had thanked me specifically for inspiring her dedication to learning and fairness. I had kept a copy of that speech in my desk drawer. pulling it out whenever the weight of teaching felt too heavy, whenever I doubted that I was making any difference. The letter detailed her involvement in cold, detached terms, forged testing schedules, falsified security protocols, payments made to her personal account totaling over $140,000 across 2 years. But what haunted me wasn't the bureaucratic language of the charges. It was the memory of her face when she first told me about her acceptance to teacher training college. The pure joy, the unshakable belief that she would use her knowledge to make education fairer for everyone. Where had that light gone? How had the girl who once stayed after class to discuss the importance of equal opportunities become a woman who sold exam papers like commodities in the market? What had I failed to give her that might have protected her from this? But as I read further, at last there was another letter inside. The letter wasn't just an informational notice. It was an official notice of suspension and investigation. The ground beneath me dissolved. My eyes locked onto the paragraph that explained why the messenger had been trembling. Sarah hadn't just been caught. She had testified. And she hadn't pointed the finger at a criminal syndicate or a corrupt politician. She pointed it at me. In light of Ms. Martinez's sworn testimony, the letter read, "You are hereby identified as a person of interest. Ms. Martinez has cited your pedagogical methods as the architectural framework of her administrative strategy. She claims her approach to systemic optimization was directly derived from your mentorship. The government was freezing my pension. I was effectively fired, pending an inquiry into my complicity. The accusation hit me harder than a physical blow. She wasn't blaming me for taking the money. She was blaming me for the logic that justified it. I had taught her to be efficient. I had taught her that the result was the only metric that mattered. When she rigged those tests, she wasn't rebelling against my teachings. She was applying them. She had treated the exam papers exactly as I had taught her to treat knowledge, as a tool for advancement, stripped of its moral weight. I spent that entire evening pacing my small apartment, the letter clutched in my trembling hands. I tried to tell myself it wasn't my fault, that I couldn't be responsible for every choice my students made decades after leaving my classroom. But the excuses felt thin, like paper crumbling under the weight of truth. The truth was inescapable. I had taught Sarah to follow procedures, but not to question when those procedures served corruption. I had taught her to succeed within the system, but not to define success in terms of service rather than profit. I had taught her that advancement mattered more than integrity, and she had learned the lesson perfectly. She wasn't alone. As I sat in that apartment, the letter still burning in my hands, I began to catalog the others, former students whose names had appeared in newspapers over the years, whose actions had filled me with a shame I couldn't name until now. There was Marcus Williams, now a district judge, who dismissed case after case of obvious corruption in exchange for envelopes of cash. He had once written a passionate essay for my civics class about the importance of equal justice. I'd given him an A+. There was Elena Rodriguez, an infrastructure engineer who approved construction projects without proper safety inspections. Last year, a school building collapsed during heavy rains, killing 5 children. She had been my most diligent student. always checking her calculations twice, always asking if her work was correct. There was James Thompson, a police captain who ran protection schemes from his precinct, taking money from the very people he was supposed to protect. I remembered him as a quiet boy who always stood up for classmates being bullied, who once wrote that he wanted to be a police officer so he could protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The list went on, an endless catalog of noble intentions turned into something else. Each name was a wound, each memory a reminder of how spectacularly I had failed in the one thing that mattered most, teaching them not what to think, but how to remain human. One corrupt teacher creates dozens of corrupt students. Dozens of corrupt students create hundreds of corrupt officials. Hundreds of corrupt officials create thousands of corrupt systems. Thousands of corrupt systems create millions of broken lives. The mathematics of moral failure. I counted and recounted the names like a miser counting coins. 37 years of teaching, approximately 3,000 students. Conservative estimate, 300 now in positions of power. Statistical probability based on current evidence, 30% using their positions for personal gain at public expense. 90 officials I helped corrupt, thousands of decisions tainted by my teaching, millions of lives affected by the lessons I never should have taught. The numbers swam in front of my eyes, my vision blurred, my breathing grew shallow. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in on me. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to block it all out, but the rhythm started in my head. My fault, my fault, my fault. I built this. I built this. They learned. They learned. They learned. The letter fell from my trembling fingers, but the damage was done. I finally understood what I had spent 37 years building. Not a generation of educated citizens, but an army of ethical zombies, trained to follow procedures without conscience, to achieve success without counting the human cost. That night, staring at my reflection in the dark window, I made a decision. If I had helped create this system of corruption, if my teaching had somehow made my students complicit in evil, then perhaps the least I could do was stand publicly against that evil. Perhaps it was time for the teacher to learn his own lesson about the cost of moral courage. The morning of the protest. I rose before dawn, after lying in bed the whole night, unable to sleep. My body felt heavy, aching with a slight fever and a persistent headache. The letter was still on the kitchen table. Its words burned into my mind. Fraud, bribes, names I knew, names I had taught. The coffee I had made the night before sat untouched, cold and forgotten, like everything else in my life. I didn't decide to go to the protest. It wasn't a choice, not really. It felt inevitable, like my legs were moving on their own. I dressed carefully, buttoning my shirt with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. It felt like I was preparing for something final. The bathroom mirror showed a stranger, a man hollowed out by the weight of realization. I was 61, but looked decades older. The respected headmaster Michael was gone. In his place, I saw something beggar-like staring back, a gaunt figure with a long white beard, stripped of dignity but somehow more honest. It was the face of a man who could no longer live with the comfortable lies that had sustained me for so long. I walked through my apartment one last time, seeing it with new eyes. The bookshelves lined with educational texts that had taught me to create compliant citizens rather than thinking human beings. The commendations and awards on the walls that celebrated my success at producing morally hollow graduates who would later sell their integrity for career advancement. The desk where I had written lesson plans that emphasized obedience over conscience, achievement over integrity. This apartment was a museum of my failure, and I was leaving it behind. The streets were quiet when I stepped outside. The air was cool, damp with morning mist. I walked without thinking, my feet carrying me toward the city center. The closer I got, the louder it became. Voices, chants, the sound of something breaking, not glass, but something deeper, something harder to fix. Other people moved in the same direction. Young faces, old faces, workers still wearing their uniforms from night shifts, mothers carrying children too young to understand, but old enough to remember. Above their heads, a forest of signs bobbed in the air, scrawled with angry, desperate ink. Punish the corrupt. Justice for honest students. Our future is not for sale. All of them moving toward the same destination. All of them carrying the same burden of accumulated injustice that had finally become too heavy to bear in silence. These people still had something I had helped my students lose: the capacity for moral outrage. They could still recognize injustice when they saw it. They hadn't been educated out of their ability to feel anger at corruption, to demand better from their leaders, to believe that change was possible. As I joined the growing crowd, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not hope that the protest would accomplish anything concrete. I was too old and too cynical for that kind of naive optimism. But hope that it was still possible to choose conscience over comfort, truth over convenience, moral courage over professional security. When I arrived at the main square, they were already gathered. The smell of sweat mingling with the sharp tang of desperation and determination. I found myself shouting along with them before I had even fully taken in the scene. Banners waved in defiance, slogans painted red against white fabric. I shouted until my throat burned. No more bribes, no more injustice. And in those moments, perhaps for the first time in years, I believed the words. It felt right, righteous even, to stand against the corruption that had spread through every institution, every level of society. For once in my adult life, I was on the right side of something that mattered. For once, I was teaching by example rather than empty words. The irony wasn't lost on me, that a teacher should stand with citizens who still retained some capacity for moral outrage. These protesters, at least, had not yet been educated out of their ability to recognize injustice when they saw it. They still believed that wrongs could be righted, that voices raised in unison could pierce the deaf ears of power. But righteousness has its price, and I was about to learn the exact cost of mine. The air shifted before they arrived. I could feel it, like standing under a sky about to break open in a storm. Tension crackled through the crowd. Voices that had been rising in hope began to take on edges of fear and defiance. The peaceful protest was about to become something else entirely. They came soon enough. Rows of officers in khaki uniforms, shields raised, batons gripped tightly in hands that twitched with practiced aggression. The crowd around me pressed closer, voices rising to meet the approaching wall of uniforms. I braced myself, an old man in a sea of younger protesters, thinking dimly that perhaps this was fitting, that a teacher should stand with citizens who still possessed something I had failed to nurture in my own students. As the officers formed their lines, their faces hidden behind riot gear, I felt a strange sense of completion. After 37 years of teaching compliance, I was finally learning the lesson I should have taught, that sometimes moral courage requires accepting the consequences of standing up to unjust authority. I was about to discover just how personal those consequences could be.